Hey everyone, let's talk for a moment about the origins of the Gothic. You'll be reading an article this week that talks about um, how the European form of the Gothic novel was co-opted, I guess you could say, by American writers in adapting those Gothic ideas, conventions to the American landscape. So what do you have in front of you? And I don't have a lot of images in this presentation, but this is a painting by Caspar Friedrich, and pretty much sums up what the Gothic genre during the Romantic Age in Europe was all about. Um, it's a night sky. It's the remains of an abbey. So you see parts of the churchyard outside there, what we call a cemetery, old stunted trees, just a sliver of a moon up there, darkening sky, very lonely, very spooky. This is where our current ideas of scary ghost stories and movies comes from. So what we have, let me get my lecture up here. Um, what we have in this slide preview is some of the conventions of what we think of now as horror novels, right? This is where this all began. Early 19th century, late 18th century in Europe. Um, Stories were often set in the medieval period. They were looking backwards to a time when um, there were still a lot of monasteries before the Reformation, before those were destroyed, and so we could have castles and old abbeys and ghosts and subterranean passages and dungeons and secret rooms, secret passageways, anything that was spooky and chilling. So this term Gothic has also been extended beyond that medieval setting, as it says here in the glossary of literary terms, a brooding atmosphere of gloom or terror, events which are uncanny or macabre or melodramatically violent, and deals with the aberrant psychological states. So people who have murdered someone, or necrophilia, or monks who shouldn't be having relationships with women, capturing them, kidnapping them, raping them, aberrant things that weren't done, right? So you can kind of already see that the term has been extracted from a specific type of novel, a specific type of painting and architecture, etc., into something a little more general, which is why we are able to move the Gothic novel to North America and still make it work. So again, it began with later 18th century writers. Imitation medievalism, that's a good way of looking at it. And again, some more of those tropes, castles, moans, screaming, all those sorts of things. In the late 1960s through the 1970s, there was a type of woman's romance novel called the Gothic novel and Gothic romances. And usually on the cover there was a woman fleeing from a castle or a private home back on a cliff overlooking the ocean often, and there would just be one light on up in a window way up at the top of the building, and she's usually in her nightgown and she's fleeing with terror. So these kind of stories, like Jane Eyre, was a good example of a later Victorian Gothic novel where you have a young woman who is away from her protectors. She's on her own for whatever reason. She's lost her parents, or she's run away from something, and she often takes up a position with the family as a governess, something where she is by herself. Often they would have women who were cataloging the castle's library or something like that, and there was always something scary happening. A housekeeper who seemed to know all the secrets but was very antagonistic to the heroine. And then the hero who is brooding over his first wife's death or something else that has gone wrong, so you never know if the hero is the bad guy or the good guy. This sort of trope grew out of this early Gothic novel. We'll come back to Strawberry Hill in a moment. I just want to go ahead to Anne Radcliffe. She was one of the most popular Gothic writers. She wrote The Romance of the Forest, The Mysteries of Udolpho, among others, in which these kind of characters were set down for the first time. So Horace Walpole wrote what we kind of consider the first romantic Gothic novel, and he bought this estate, Strawberry Hill, and he remodeled it so it would have that Gothic appearance, and it became very popular and spread like fads tend to do. But again, this medieval kind of Gothic architecture, or imitation medieval, nothing a lot really to do with the real medieval architecture or the early Gothic architecture. He wrote a novel called The Castle of Otranto in 1764, a very short novel, but it has all the ingredients of what we now consider a Gothic novel: the haunted castle, all sorts of ghosts and things. But it's a precursor to Anne Radcliffe, who we've mentioned already, and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and some writers like Jane Austen made fun of the passion for the fad for these novels in a book called Northanger Abbey, where the young heroine reads entirely too many Gothic novels and confuses it with real life. And I've listed some of these conventions that are listed in these slides here in a bulleted list to make it a little easier for you to find. The American Gothic, as the article you're going to read suggests, is what had to happen in the United States is the conventions of the Gothic had to be transferred to a situation where there were no castles, there were no dungeons. But that brooding atmosphere was still there. We have the wilderness, the forest with Indians. It's all very scary. So what you're reading in Edgar Huntley is sort of an American Gothic, and one of the questions you're being asked is how does Charles Brockden Brown take those characteristics of a European Gothic novel and transfer it to the American wilderness and still keep that kind of claustrophobic feeling that you get when you're in a dungeon or in a secret passageway. How does he translate that to an American subject? So that is probably enough to get you started on the Gothic, and we may talk more about it in another presentation.